Hello and welcome back, or welcome to Language Culture and Dr. Lou. And today I'm doing a video about some mistranslations, some translation mistakes that really impacted history because as long as languages have been around, people have been translating from one language to another. And as long as people have been translating between languages, there have been mistakes, aka mistranslations, and some of these have had a surprisingly large effect on history. And so I like to go through a few examples of this, and sometimes it's kind of funny how a mistranslation can contort things, but other times not so funny because it has real life consequences, especially when it comes to international relations and diplomacy. And so let's start out with something way back in 1830, a diplomacy problem between France and the US, which was real issue for France at the time because in 1830 in France there was something called the July Revolution where they pretty much ousted King Charles X and installed King Louis Philippe. And so when a country is going through turmoil and big changes like that, that's when you really need your allies. And if you didn't know, France is pretty much the oldest ally that the United States of America has. They have been our allies since the beginning of the country, considering that France supplied a lot of the ammunition and guns and all of that that we needed to beat the British in the American Revolution. And by the way, that kind of bankrupted France a little bit and set the stage for the French Revolution. But in 1830, France was still a monarchy, although parliamentary, but still had a king. And the kings changed because big things in society changed, and so France needed our help. And in a statement that came from Paris, France, to Washington, D.C., United States, um, we had a statement that came that said, Le gouvernement français demande, which simply means the French government asks. And by the time it got to President Andrew Jackson, it had been mistranslated because of a confusion over the verb demander, where the French used that in demande, and they mistook it for the English word demands. And so the French government demands. So that really stalled diplomatic talks for a little while between King Louis Philippe and Andrew Jackson, well, between United States and France, which was a real problem when you're going through something at the time. And eventually, though, the translation was corrected, and so then diplomatic talks could resume. But again, it was a slight hiccup, which in the US, things were going a little better at the time than they were in France. And so it's kind of a shame that we couldn't step in and help him out a little bit because of a simple word misunderstanding. And so also in the 19th century, um, there was a mistranslation that didn't affect politics or diplomacy, but really did affect our impressions of life on Mars. In 1877, there was an Italian astronomer, I do believe, his name was Giovanni Virginio Scarapelli, and he was trying to map the planet Mars, trying to map it, and he was really using a telescope, of course, and seeing he was differentiating between dark spots and light spots as a distinction between oceans and continents, supposing what was the continental shape of Mars and all the sea shapes and whatnot. And another thing that he noticed were little channels of dark spots connecting some of the bigger ones. So he used, when describing that, he used the Italian word canali, which means channels, and that was mistranslated as canals. And so that really set off like a whole new sci-fi genre, pretty much. Uh, because canals, as you know, canals are man-made. These are uh, trenches that are constructed by intelligent life. And so that would mean that if there are truly canals on Mars, then there must be intelligent life on Mars. And so this is way back since the 19th century. Uh, we started thinking, huh, there's Martians building canals and all that, but none of that ended up being true. And eventually, even the fact that there were channels on Mars, which it was a little disproven, we have a better understanding today of what it looks like. But yeah, so canali for channels being swapped into canals totally changed Earthlings' impression of life on Mars. And so let's get back to Earth. Speaking of Earthlings let's get back to Earth and into the 20th century. One of the biggest events of the 20th century was when the US dropped the atom bomb on Japan twice, actually. And this may have been prevented if only the translation was better. If only, if not for mistranslation, this might not have had to happen. Um, or at least, anyway, we would have possibly tried a little more diplomacy first. And so what I mean by that is Kantaro Suzuki, yeah, Suzuki, like the cars and vehicles and all that. Um, he was the he was replying to the Allies, so he was the a premier, and he was replying to the Allies, and I don't mean Japan's allies, okay, in World War II. I mean um, the USA and Great Britain and France, the Allies, our allies. That's who I'm talking about. And in 1945, the Allies, um, well, had not dropped any atomic bombs yet, but we were demanding Japan's unconditional surrender for World War II. We demanded they surrender unconditionally, so they wouldn't get anything about out of it. They just surrender. And so uh, they were replying to the Allies, and Premier Suzuki's response, he used the word mokusatsu, which often in Japan at the time and still to this day, politicians used to say no comment. It means silence or no comment. And unfortunately, this word can be translated multiple ways into English. And so silence or no comment, or sometimes silent contempt, or to treat with contempt. And that was more the direction that the translators went when they translated this from Japanese into English. And so the translation read more like, instead of no comment, it read more like, we categorically reject your ultimatum, as if Japan was giving a big fat no, never, ever, ever, you bullies. That is a much more dangerous uh, position for international relations, especially when a war like that was going on. And the US had the axe to grind because of Pearl Harbor and all that. And so, unfortunately, well, I don't think that Suzuki's reply was the wisest of all because no comment, even if it had come across as no comment, maybe something more respectful, like we acknowledge we have received your demand and we are in the process of considering it, something like that to push off any more attacks on you would have, in my opinion, been better. But hey, hindsight is always better 2020. And so, and the reason why this was such a huge diplomatic failure is it was only 10 days after this that the US dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. And then only 3 days after that, that we dropped the bomb on Nagasaki. That's why you have two different bomb pictures there. And I'm sad that this might have been able to be avoided if only better diplomacy through better translations had happened. I don't know. It's very, very, very sad. So right after World War II, of course, we get to the Cold War. But before we're getting to the Cold War, let's do something a little bit more fun, a little bit lighter. There was a funny thing that happened with the mistranslation slash misunderstanding of things involved in Valentine's Day in Japan. The thing is, Japan kind of had a little Valentine's Day already. It didn't really expand all that much yet, but it had started a little before that. But what happened was a confectionery executive, confectionery companies, the ones that make candies and chocolates and all that. He had gotten, well, these chocolates from Westerners, and so translated from English into Japanese was the chocolates are intended for women. And so the misunderstanding over that was because the Westerners meant that these chocolates are intended to be purchased by men and then who would give them as gifts to women, right? But that's not how they went with at that confectionery company in Japan and other confectionery companies too. And so their company did a whole advertising campaign about how these chocolates are intended for women. And their push on it was that the women would buy the chocolates and then give them to the men. So it was kind of the exact reverse of what the Westerners who had sold them those chocolates in the first place had been keeping in mind. And it did end up starting a very different kind of Valentine's Day um, tradition in Japan because now, still to this day, I do believe that on February 14th, uh, women give chocolates to the men. It's still sort of going that way. But interestingly, a month later, in March, then the men sort of return the favor and they give things to the women. So it's interesting that Valentine's Day, in that sense, comes in two parts in Japan, kind of like in the US, how we have Mother's Day in May and then Father's Day in June. Um, but anyway, so that's funny that this mistranslation and this misunderstanding prompted a whole new holiday tradition for a whole culture. Very cool. So, like I said, we're getting back to the Cold War now. So, one big mistranslation that made the tensions really higher in the Cold War was in 1956, a statement by Nikita Khrushchev, who, by the way, he was the first secretary of the Communist Party of the USSR. That was his position. I think he got in there in the early 50s, more like 53. But and then he would go on to other things. But he was a big deal in the USSR. To give you an idea, his predecessor was Joseph Stalin, to give you an idea how big of a guy he was in history. And so he made a statement, and he was really referring to, well, some Karl Marx writings and references to how the bourgeoisie in capitalist societies is only really creating their own grave diggers, meaning that their own working class would bury them. Like, and so he was saying that communism would outlast capitalism because capitalism would naturally destroy itself. So the way he put it was, whether you like it or not, history is on our side. We will dig you in. And the scary headline, the scary mistranslation, which ended up as a headline on papers all over the world, was as if he said, "We will bury you." And that is much more aggressive, much more threatening of a thing than he wanted to say, because what he was trying to say is communism is far superior to capitalism. So you might as well give it up. And like claiming superiority, whereas the way it got translated was more like, okay, he's almost threatening an attack. Years later, he, or maybe it was only months later, but he further qualified this. He sort of corrected it and said, "We didn't mean that we were going to literally bury you with shovels. We just we just meant that your working class would bury you." But anyway, so that was one thing that heated up some tensions in the Cold War and didn't really get a lot better because both sides were very ignorant of what each other was up to, and much of that was on purpose, and a lot of it was through terrible botched diplomacy and on top of, hiding things from each other. And so we're still in the Cold War for the next one, which is a little more interesting. And so we're in 1977 now, when Jimmy Carter, who was president of the US at the time, when he was in Poland, he had a trip to Poland, and he had a terrible translator who honestly should not have been translating from English to Polish. That translator's specialty was Russian, so fluent in Russian and fluent in English, but he also spoke Polish. So for this particular trip, they were having him translate between English and Polish. And he would never be hired to translate into to Polish again after this trip. He would just go back to doing only Russia because he really botched a couple of translations. And for example, the first one, which is kind of funny, when Jimmy Carter was saying, "I left the United States this morning," somehow this got mistranslated into, "I left the United States never to return," which is, I'm sure, very confusing if you're a Polish person hearing that, and you got to wonder what the heck he's trying to say. Is he really abandoning the US forever? But anyway, so confusing and not really helping diplomacy. He was just saying, "I left the US this morning." This was the day he arrived in Warsaw, right? And so that one was a little confusing, but not the biggest uh flop in the world. But again, I don't see how this morning gets turned into never to return. But then again, I don't know Polish, so I wouldn't know how that could happen. And so another mistake that the same translator made on the same trip was when Jimmy Carter was saying something like, "I am happy to be in Poland." It got seriously mistranslated into something that took on like sexual vibes, sexual content kind of deal, where it got mistranslated instead of am happy to be in Poland. It was into am happy to grasp for Poland's private parts, like as if the guy we're talking about grabbing at the genitals of the Polish people. That's a little scary. And no, he didn't say that. And that's why, again, that translator was fired from any job in well, he wasn't hired again to do Polish because that's really confusing and pretty funny. Um, and what's funny is that Jimmy Carter never said that. He just meant, I'm happy to be here. He was trying to show some respect, which it was important at the time because this is during the Cold War. And at the time in 77, Poland was indeed a communist country. So this was a big deal for him to be visiting over there, and good time for diplomatic uh, healing and relations and friendship. But instead, he had a lousy translator. So he said a bunch of weird stuff. And this is also funny because Jimmy Carter did not say this. He was not wanting to grab at anybody's genitalia. And to me, it's funny because I can think of two former presidents who would have maybe said something like this. And I'm talking Bill Clinton and Donald Trump, both alleged uh well, sexual predators, pretty much. But anyway, so let's get away from politics and back to how much translations can really muck up history. Um, and so if you did get anything out of this video, please drop a like. So give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channels. And if this video does well, I would be happy to sort of look into more mistranslations from just the last 40, 50 years, bring it a little more into recent history. So anyway, until then, I will see you around next time. And thank you so much for everybody who watches my videos to the very end.